come forward and to lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance. Please stand if you haven't already.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you, Bill. And just a couple of announcements. First, again, as in for many years, we thank Starbucks of Lexington Center for donating the delicious coffee we've enjoyed. And we thank the many volunteers who take the time and trouble to donate baked goods so that we can enjoy some delicious goodies with the coffee. Thank you, too. And we also thank the people who so far have been kind enough to put a small donation in the basket that's located right next to the coffee pot. That helps us defray our overhead and our modest operating costs, and we thank you very much for that. And now, let's get to the introduction of the speaker that you've all come to see. He might be a familiar figure to some of you because he has regularly spoken next door at the Bedford Library. His name is DanBreen. He's an assistant professor at Newberry College in Brookline. Now, Dan grew up in Atlanta, and he tells me that the Union Army soldiers marched right down the street where he lived. Not only that, but if you take the trouble to walk the streets of Atlanta, you'll see that at many of the streets and the intersections, there are markers that will tell you exactly where and which Union troops marched right down the streets. So it's no wonder that he grew up with not only a passion for history, but for Civil War history in particular. But his passion for history developed a little late. He decided first that he would have a career in law. After graduation from the University of Wisconsin with a BA in history, Dan returned to Georgia and he earned a law degree in 1987 from the University of Georgia. It was only after practicing law for about 3 years that he decided he was going to make history his career. He earned a master's degree in history from the University of Georgia, and then he headed up to Boston, where he earned a PhD in history from Boston College, and he never left. After 4 years at Framingham State College, Dan moved to his present position as assistant professor of history at Newberry College in Brookline. Because the faculty at Newberry is so small, Dan gets to teach every course in the entire history curriculum, which he says is just a great treat for him. He keeps his legal hand in by teaching legal studies at Brandeis University. Now, Dan recently gave a talk on the Spanish-American War, a war that he believes was far more difficult and challenging than the cakewalk that so many of us are led to believe it was. He enjoys giving presentations about campaigns like these that involve overcoming insurmountable obstacles and taking big risks. And that's why he has chosen to tell us the story of the Vicksburg campaign. And I'm going to let Dan tell us the rest of the story, to quote somebody.
Okay.
So please welcome DanBreen.
Well, thank you very much. So you can all hear me? That doesn't sound too bad? Okay.
Well, thank you for that introduction. And it is true that I grew up in Atlanta, and it was very easy to learn about the Civil War in Atlanta, especially if you were observant, because the traffic is so bad. You were always, at one time or another, spending about a half hour by a marker by the side of the road waiting to go, and that's how you would learn. So a lot of people in Atlanta do know about their Civil War history, luckily, and that's certainly true about people in Vicksburg, as you all know if you've been there. I know some of you in the audience have been to Vicksburg, and you could probably vouch for the fact that the residents there are quite steeped in Civil War history, and maybe we'll talk a bit about your experiences when you went to Vicksburg and how you felt about it during the Q&A. But what I would like to talk about is the Vicksburg campaign as what I consider to be the best example of joint Army-Navy cooperation during the Civil War, and a test case and an example of what can be done when you've got two commanders, an Army commander and a Navy commander, who think the same way about the task in front of them and are willing to cooperate, putting professional jealousies aside. And I think that was true throughout most of the Vicksburg campaign. So let's talk about that now. And if you look at the map, there, of course, is Vicksburg. You've got, most of you, I think, a couple maps in front of you that will help tell the tale as we go along. But it's okay if you don't have the maps, because I'll go back and forth to these slides if need be during the course of my talk. But if you want to know why Vicksburg was so important, why in fact it was probably the most important place in the Confederacy by the middle of 1862, the map will help tell the tale. First of all, there, of course, is Vicksburg, sitting on bluffs about 200 feet high, stretching over the Mississippi. And you'll notice that Vicksburg is at a very narrow bend in the Mississippi. And the consequence of that bend was that as the southward flowing Mississippi turned around that bend, it narrowed out on the eastern bank, a very, very deep place for steamboats to land. And the course of the Mississippi, therefore, ideally made Vicksburg a tremendous landing for commerce going up and down the Mississippi. That's one reason it was such an important place. The other reason might be better illustrated by the next slide. And here you see the state of Mississippi, and the fact that Vicksburg, which is right about there, was also the site of the only east-west railroad between Memphis and New Orleans. And what that meant during the Civil War was that all the commerce from the trans-Mississippi Confederate West, all that sugar, all that wheat, all that corn, all that wealth, all those material of any sort whatever coming from the west would cross around Vicksburg to get to the east. Vicksburg, in other words, was the great choke point on the Mississippi. Everything from the west, if it needed to get to the east, was going to go through Vicksburg. And as long as the Confederacy held Vicksburg, as long as they had that railroad, not a bridge, but at least a crossing where the railroad would be, where the railroad would meet anything coming from the west, the Confederacy could claim itself to be a nation. Without Vicksburg, without that crossing, without that commerce, without those supplies from the west, the Confederacy was slowly choked to death. The Confederacy had to have Vicksburg at all costs. It had to hold it as a great center of commerce and transportation. And it's still true today. Vicksburg, as many of you know, happens to be the place where I-20 crosses the Mississippi. So some things don't change. It's still a great center of east-west commerce, as well as north-south commerce to the present day. Any fool could see the importance of Vicksburg, but anybody could also see that this was going to be a very difficult place to take. And one reason for that, you can see from the next slide, is the fact that Vicksburg sat just to the south of very steep bluffs overlooking the Yazoo River. To the north of the Yazoo was the swampy delta, a wilderness in 1862, a paradise of mosquitoes and snakes and crocodiles and all sorts of other species not yet discovered or named by science. And on the south side of the delta, on the south side of the Yazoo, there were those bluffs, which would be extremely difficult to attack, if not suicidal. The Yazoo River was known throughout the North by now because there'd been a big scandal back in the early 19th century about the Yazoo and the lands that were purchased from the Indians there. And it was also a very alliterative name, so that when Stephen Foster went to write a song about life in the South, he chose the Yazoo as part of the title of the song until his brother said, Yazoo sounds funny, people aren't going to like that. So he decided to choose Swanee as the name of the song. But even despite that, people knew the Yazoo. What they didn't know was what a devilish place it really was, especially with the swampy delta right above it, stretching all the way about 100 miles north along the Mississippi River and along the east bank. So if you wanted to capture Vicksburg, the thing you were going to have to do, unfortunately, was, by all accounts, either proceed directly south from Memphis, keeping the delta in the swamps to your right, that is to your west, as you proceeded towards Vicksburg from the north. And that's what Grant and Sherman were going to eventually try to do. That's how the Army would do it. At least that's what the Army was planning to do.
But could the Navy take Vicksburg all by itself? And thus, if the Navy could do that, the Army wouldn't have to march through enemy-held territory in the middle of the Mississippi and perhaps risk destruction if any force should hope to approach Grant and Sherman from the Confederate east. Now, the man who thought he might be able to take Vicksburg with a naval force alone was none other than David Farragut, the greatest Union naval hero of the war, a man who actually commanded a vessel in the Northern Navy, the American Navy during the War of 1812. At the age, I think, of 12 years old. I think he commanded a vessel when he was that young. So this was a guy who spent his career in the Navy, rescued from mothballs at the beginning of the Civil War, and no sooner had he been rescued from mothballs and put in command of a force in the lower Mississippi, he went against all odds, and he was able to take New Orleans in April of 1862, and the greatest Union victory of the war up to that point. So what Farragut wanted to do after taking New Orleans was steam and sail north in the Mississippi and see if he could take Vicksburg with a naval force plus about 3,000 or 4,000 troops along for good measure. So there he was steaming north on his famous flagship, the USS Hartford, and as he looked at the maps of Vicksburg, the citadel of the Confederacy that he was approaching, one thing caught his eye, and it's probably the same thing that would catch your eye too, and that is this peninsula here. Why not cut a canal right about there, right over what was called the DeSoto Peninsula, and why not let the Mississippi flow through that canal, leaving those 200-foot height bluffs of Vicksburg high and dry off to the east, and thus the Navy could control the Mississippi and Vicksburg would be irrelevant. In other words, why not change the course of the Mississippi? It looked easy on the map. Just dig the canal, you'd never have to worry about Vicksburg. The Mississippi would flow right through and all would be well. Well, it was a lot difficult, a lot more difficult than it looked. It looked fine, but when you actually began to dig on that peninsula, it turned out to be hard clay. A lot harder than anybody expected, but the fact that the railroad went through there should have clued them in that this was not going to be easy. So here we've got thousands of slaves who probably thought they were free, but they were considered contraband, and they were put to work trying to cut through that peninsula, along with whatever soldiers were enlisted to do the job as well, working in the summer of 1862 to dig that canal, setting all-time records for cursing in the process, and sending hundreds of sweating men to sick beds and sometimes to their deaths, trying to dig that canal. It was just too surprisingly hard to make very quick progress with the picks and the shovels that they had. And since it was summertime, of course, it's June and July of 1862, it's not just hot by now, it is also the case that the Mississippi River was beginning to fall, so that as soon as they dug the canal, any distance into the ground, the river was falling along with it, so the water never quite went through the way they expected. And the fact was it was never going to get through because, as any experienced engineer could have seen, the Mississippi flowing to the north into the west of that peninsula flows so fast along the eastern bank that it never is in any mood to go through that canal. And that's why it never worked. Would have been a very easy way to win the campaign, despite the sweat involved, but it simply never worked despite months of trying. Well, what the Army of the Tennessee couldn't do, what Farragut couldn't do, nature could do. And as some of you know, in 1876, there was a great hurricane around Vicksburg, and what happened was that nature did what Farragut could not do. And let's see if I can get the right slide here. This is what Vicksburg looks like today. And what happened was nature did cut across that DeSoto Peninsula, and the consequence was that Vicksburg really was left high and dry after the hurricane of 1876. And what they had to do was dig a canal from the Yazoo down to the Mississippi, and today Vicksburg is sitting on that canal. Most of it is not on the Mississippi. But that was 1876, and was going to do no good to the Union in 1862. Now, as work on the canal was fruitlessly going forward in the summer of 1862, there was only one thing that Farragut really had to worry about, and he didn't even take that threat very seriously. He had about 37 ironclads and ships of sail on the Mississippi, north and south of Vicksburg, a very strong force indeed. But the one thing that was preying on his mind was that the Confederacy was building its own ironclad vessel at the same time on the Yazoo River, and here it is. Way up the Yazoo, about 75 to 100 miles up the river, the Confederacy was building this ironclad vessel called the Arkansas. And they were spending a lot of money and a lot of time on it, and it was commanded by a guy who knew his business, a captain in the Confederate Navy named Isaac Brown. Now, Farragut didn't think the Arkansas would dare go into the Mississippi and challenge his fleet. What is one Confederate ironclad versus Farragut's Navy on the Mississippi? But what he didn't take account of was the fact that the Yazoo River was falling in July of 1862 at the same time as the Mississippi falling at almost the same rate. And that meant that Captain Brown on the Arkansas had a dismal choice. Either he was going to be left in the mud of the Yazoo if he just left that Arkansas where it was, or he was going to have to go down the Yazoo into the deep lower Yazoo and then into the Mississippi to Vicksburg, where he might seek some safety. But what that would mean is taking on the Union fleet. Well, he had really no choice. If the Arkansas was going to do any good at all, it had to get into the Mississippi, it had to get to the deep water around Vicksburg, it had to challenge the Union Navy. And so out of the Yazoo he came, into the deep lower Yazoo where Union vessels were stationed at the time. And as the Arkansas approached, there's the Arkansas, lookouts on the Union ironclads in the lower Yazoo shot. It's the Arkansas is coming. Now, Captain Brown had told his crew this is a do-or-die mission. This is the actual speech he gave to his crew on the Arkansas. Many of them people who had never been on a vessel of any sort before. They were recruited and trained as best they could be trained for what many of them now probably thought was something like a suicide mission, because this is what Brown told them. We must win or perish. Should I fall, Captain Brown said, should I fall, whomever takes over must resolve to go through the enemy's fleet or sink to the bottom. On no account must this ship fall to the enemy. Gentlemen, to your guns. So the decks were sanded to prevent slippage in the blood that was sure to flow. Everybody was stripped to the waist in the July heat, the extreme heat of the Yazoo River in the middle of the summer. And the Arkansas approached the Union fleet. And soon the Arkansas was peppered with the shot of Union cannonballs, pounded. And within 3 minutes, Captain Brown himself was injured 2 times. There were holes in the smokestack by now. The temperature on the lower Yazoo in the Arkansas was 130 degrees, so hot that the men working the engines and working the guns couldn't stay down there for more than 15 minutes at a time. They had to go back and forth to the deck, to the hold, to the deck, to the hold. They would faint if they were more than 15 minutes down there. But the Union vessels could do no more than fire at the Arkansas. They couldn't approach her because Farragut took that threat so unseriously that he had not caused the Union ironclads to get their steam up. They weren't ready to go. All they could do was watch while the Arkansas approached the Mississippi, turned to the left towards Vicksburg. They could fire at the Arkansas, but they had a hard time approaching her. And the consequence was that somehow, after 2 hours of constant battle through the heart of the Union fleet, running the gauntlet, as it were, the Arkansas made it, at long last, later in the morning, to the wharves of Vicksburg, its safety. One of the great exploits of the entire Civil War. And the people of Vicksburg had watched it happen. They had been on the rooftops above the bluffs, watching the Arkansas make her brave, steady way in the heat, in the shot, in the explosions. And when she tied up at the wharves of Vicksburg, joyously, the people of Vicksburg rushed down to the wharves to greet their heroes. And as they approached the ironclad, the Arkansas, and as they went on board to celebrate the men who had done this, the seemingly impossible feat, they were taken aback. They looked into the hold, and on the deck, what they saw was not just blood, not just gore. They saw headless torsos. They saw arms and legs strewn about. They saw wounded men screaming in agony. And what they actually saw, of course, was something most civilians never see, which is what war really is, what war really was about. And sheepishly, they turned aside, and they wanted no more of what they had just seen on the Arkansas. After all, very few of the people of Vicksburg were Southerners. Only 1/3 of them had been born in the South. Most people in Vicksburg were from Europe or from the North. They were there to make money. It was a great city of commerce. Most of them did not want this war. They knew what it meant for them, an interruption in commerce, perhaps disaster. But now that the war had come, they supported it to the last. And now they knew what that meant. Now they knew what war really was. And if there's one thing Farragut now knew, it was that, in all likelihood, if that canal was not going to work, and if these batteries on the bluffs of Vicksburg were going to get stronger and stronger, there was no way the Navy could take Vicksburg all by itself. And that meant, could the Army take Vicksburg all by itself? Later in 1862, the Army tried to do just that. Farragut sailed his forces south of Vicksburg, back down the Mississippi to the neighborhood of New Orleans, leaving a force of ironclads between Vicksburg and Memphis, north of Vicksburg. And in the meantime, Grant and Sherman decided to make their way south. Sherman attacked those bluffs, those impregnable bluffs to the north of Vicksburg. He came to grief, suffered grievously, had to retreat. Grant was traveling down the basic line of the railroad from north to south to the east of where Sherman was. He turned back when his supply depot was raided and destroyed in Holly Springs, Mississippi, which some of you can see in your maps near the Tennessee line. And once his supply depot was destroyed, he decided to turn back too. This was 1862. The Grant of 1864 might not have turned back, but the Grant of 1862 turned back. Supply depot's gone. Grant's going to go to Plan B. And Plan B was to cross the Mississippi and forget about the eastern side, cross and proceed down the western side of the Mississippi and approach Vicksburg somehow from that direction. And what that meant, if Grant was going to be on the other side of the Mississippi, going down the western side, that meant that this had to be a joint Army-Navy operation. There was no substitute for that. If anybody was going to take Vicksburg, it had to be the Army and the Navy together. Enter the man who would finally be the main character in our story. There he is, the commander of the Union ironclad fleet to the north of Vicksburg, David Dixon Porter. A man who'd been in the Navy since the age of 10. His father had been the great David Dixon Porter, who was the first man to take a Union warship around Cape Horn. Did that, of course, during the War of 1812. His grandfather had served in the Revolutionary Navy. He had the Navy, in other words, in his blood. And it goes beyond that. David Farragut himself was David Dixon Porter's older foster brother. They'd grown up together in Louisiana mostly, and then in Pennsylvania. And his brother was serving in the Union fleet under David Dixon Porter. David Dixon Porter's brother was the famous William Porter, who everybody called Dirty Bill. In my opinion, not one of the more fortunate nicknames of the Civil War. But his nickname was Dirty Bill Porter. The two of them never spoke, hated each other. Not convenient if somebody's serving under you in the Navy not to talk to this person. But David Dixon Porter, Dirty Bill, did not get along. And David Dixon Porter, this man here, was also the cousin of Fitzjohn Porter, who very badly commanded a corps in the Army of the Potomac, way off to the east. Now, this particular David Dixon Porter, who was in command of the ironclad fleet to the north of Vicksburg under the Union flag, had already had a very good, interesting career in the Navy. And normally, if I talked to any audience, they wouldn't know what I was talking about. But how many of you, and you can lie if you want, how many of you have ever heard of the U.S. Camel Corps? Oh, you have? Good. You have. Very good. That's 300% more than normally I would get. Back in 1855, 6 years before Fort Sumter, Jefferson Davis, Secretary of War, thought it might be a good idea if the United States bought a bunch of camels. And the reason was we had just acquired the Southwest from Mexico and also the area around Tucson and the Gadsden Purchase. And he'd never been there. He thought it was all desert. So if it's desert, the camels ought to be pretty good. And maybe the cavalry would need camels. So he sent David Dixon Porter on the USS Supply to the Mediterranean to buy a bunch of camels. And Porter showed up in Turkey, what used to be the Ottoman Empire, and bought, I think, 37 camels, something like that. And he performed his mission very well. He took the camels all the way to the United States, and unlike the usual course of events on any mission like this, he didn't lose any cargo. In fact, he gained cargo. Some of the camels gave birth on the way. So he showed up with more camels than he actually expected to. And the cavalry had camels for a while. It was kind of a bust, this whole experiment. Civil War put it to an end. But one reason I bring it up, I think probably some of you may want to do this someday. See that? If you go to Quartzville, Arizona, this is the monument to the guy that Porter hired to train the cavalry in camels. He was a Turk. His name was Haji Ali, but the cavalry guys did not want to say Haji Ali, so they called him Hi Jolly. He's always Hi Jolly to the army. And this is the monument to Hi Jolly. Hi Jolly lived for about 20 years after he got to America, and when he died, the cavalry put up this monument to him in Quartzville, Arizona. Now the camels were mostly all gone, but the last descendant of a camel that was brought over by David Dixon Porter only died in British Columbia in the 1930s. but they have no living descendants in North America that I know of. Well, back to our story. Now, David Dixon Porter was a very fine commander, in my opinion. He had a couple faults, as everybody does. One fault that he had, I think, he was a little bit too fond of high living. He liked a little bit of luxury around him. And on his headquarters ship, he had, for a long time when he was on the Mississippi, kept his own cow, so he could always have fresh milk, his own personal cow. And his kitchen on the ship was so good that Grant and Sherman used to like to take their meals on his ship rather than on land because the provisions were always much better wherever David Dixon Porter was. And the other fault I think that he had was that he was too much into backbiting. David Dixon Porter was the guy who had persuaded Gideon Welles, Lincoln's Secretary of the Navy, to rescue David Farragut from obscurity and give him that command in front of New Orleans. So that was David Dixon Porter's idea, Farragut's foster brother. But for the rest of the war, after that act of generosity, David Dixon Porter did everything he could to stab Farragut in the back for the rest of the war and try to get Gideon Welles not to like him. Luckily, it didn't work out very well. He was always complaining about something. But the good things about him, number one, he was very inventive. He was an innovative officer. And I'll just give you an example of that. There he is in command of the ironclads north of Vicksburg, and he knew it was going to be very difficult to send his entire fleet back to the south of Vicksburg for reasons we'll talk about in a second. But there one or two ships could get through at a time, and that wasn't much of a risk. So Porter thought it might be a good idea to send the USS Indianola, which was an ironclad vessel, to the south of Vicksburg, maybe to mess around with some of the commerce coming from the trans-Mississippi West. Every half hour, something was crossing the river, Confederate supplies from the West, including manufactured goods from Europe that were getting through Mexico at the time. And Porter wanted to maybe try to put a stop to that if he could. So he sent this ship to the south of Vicksburg. That's the Indianola. And no sooner had the Indianola gotten south of Vicksburg to try to disrupt commerce, but it got stuck in the mud, was shot up a bit, and captured by the Confederacy. Now this was humiliating. Porter did not want the Indianola turned against the Confederacy. So what he wanted to do was do something about this. Anybody else would have planned and delayed and maybe just made the best of things. But right away, David Dixon Porter came up with a plan. Now he didn't want to risk another real ironclad. So what he did was he made up a fake ironclad. And this is what it is. He called it the Black Terror. But what it was an old coal barge that he put a makeshift top on, which wasn't even made of iron, and he put some smudge pots that would simulate a smoke screen once the actual thing was floated down the Mississippi. And the whole thing cost $9. He just put together this dummy ship. And he called it the Black Terror, the most terrifying name, maybe in naval history, the Black Terror. And he put a sign on it for good measure, and the sign said, "Deluded people cave in." So when it went past the Vicksburg Bluffs, deluded people would see it and presumably cave in. But anyway, he set this thing going on the current after spending $9 to make it. And around the Great Bend, the DeSoto Bend it went. Confederates are firing at it. They can't quite blow it out of the water. And the current took it pretty close to the Indianola. And sure enough, the Confederates who were salvaging this Union vessel, the Indianola, panicked at the thought that the Black Terror with these guns that were really logs sticking out of it would blow them to kingdom come. And so they blew up the Indianola. And then the entire Confederacy was humiliated when the news got out that this whole thing was a dummy ship. That's the Black Terror. So he was inventive. And the other good thing about him was that unlike a lot of Navy officers, David Dixon Porter did not mind when it really came down to it and when there was any point. He did not mind risking his ships. And if you're an Army general engaged in joint operations with the Navy, that's music to your ears. A commander who will risk his ships if there's a good opportunity to be had. And he would always, when Grant thought it was a good idea, put those ships in harm's way. And a good example of his attitude came during the fall of 1862 when one of the best of the ironclads, which was the USS Cairo, managed to make its way into the Yazoo River in pursuit of some fleeing Confederate vessels. And it was going full tilt, maybe a little bit recklessly. And the USS Cairo, as you see here, hit a mine in the Yazoo. This is the late fall, early winter. I think it happened in October, November of 1962. So the Cairo hits the mine, blows up. and sinks into the Yazoo River. And the commander of the Cairo sheepishly went to his commander, David Dixon Porter, expecting that he'd be court-martialed for losing his ship. He just lost his ship. And he said to his commander, Captain Porter, I suppose there'll have to be a court of inquiry. And this is what Porter said: I have no time to hold courts. I can't blame any officer who puts his ship close to the enemy. Is there any other vessel you'd like to have? In other words, here was a man after Grant's own heart, a real Nelson here on the Mississippi. Is there any other vessel you'd like to have? And the guy who commanded the Cairo, parenthetically, was Thomas Oliver Selfridge, and his nephew, for the aviators among you, was the first man to die in the service of his country in a plane accident. He did that in the Army Air Corps, I guess, in 1909. This was another military family. And Thomas Oliver Selfridge, after being forgiven by David Dixon Porter, would spend the rest of his career illustriously in the Navy. Now, when Grant shifted down to the west bank of the Mississippi River, Porter immediately set his considerable mind to trying to figure out how to win this campaign in a joint Army-Navy operation. So picture Grant moving down the west side, approaching Vicksburg that way. How are you going to take the city? Well, maybe there's two main ways to do it. And one way was the really risky way. And one way, those of you who have maps, might be a good time to look at, but you don't really need to have them. One way would be for Porter's ironclads to brave the batteries of Vicksburg, go past Vicksburg, south of the city, pick up Grant's army, who had made its way by then south of the city, cross the Mississippi south of Vicksburg, thus averting the bluffs facing the Yazoo, and take Vicksburg from behind. You could do it that way. But there's three reasons why you wouldn't want to do it that way. Number one, going past the Vicksburg batteries was very risky for those ironclads. But it was even riskier for supply ships. So if you were to try it that way, Grant would be on the other side of the Mississippi, maybe escorted by ironclads, but for the next several weeks and months, it would be almost impossible to supply him. Supply vessels coming down the Mississippi past Vicksburg could be blown out of the water. They were not well armed like ironclads were, not well armored like they were, and as a consequence, putting Grant south of Vicksburg across the Mississippi that way would leave him without a meaningful supply line, at least for a while. Second thing that's not a good idea, he'd be alone in Mississippi, enemy-held territory. Not just without much of a supply line, but creating a danger that way, the Confederates might take their armies under Pemberton in Vicksburg, in Johnston, at Jackson, and also in lower Tennessee, combine against Grant, who was cut off from the rest of the North, and destroy them at their leisure. That was number two, very risky. And number three, and this was foremost in Porter's mind, once the ironclads got south of Vicksburg, there's no going back. Once they're south, that's it. Because once they go south of Vicksburg, they're along with the current. They're steaming with the current. They can make good headway that way. But if they're going to go against the current, rounding that bend, they have to go much slower, and they could be blown out of the water. And nobody with any sense would want to do that, go north of Vicksburg against the current. And as a consequence, going south of Vicksburg was the last resort. And what that meant was you had to do it another way. Now, you can't attack the bluffs that were actually outside of Vicksburg to the north, lining the Yazoo. So was there a way you could take those ironclads and any transports carrying troops through the bogs, in the bayous, in the swamps, in the mosquitoes of the Delta, and get around the bluffs to the north of Vicksburg and then to the city that way, with a nice secure supply route through the Delta that could keep Grant in the field indefinitely? Couldn't you get to Vicksburg by crossing from the west to the east through the Delta? And Grant thought there was a way, and so did Porter. And the way was this. And here we go to the first major way they're going to try to get to Vicksburg. If you look up here, way to the north in the Mississippi, a great levee had been built in 1856 to hold back the Mississippi so that in some parts of the Great Delta, maybe cotton could be planted. And it would turn into the greatest cotton land on the planet Earth eventually. But they were just beginning to do it in the 1850s. Now, they built that levee to keep the Delta drier. Now, what if you could blow up that levee? If you blew up that levee, water from the Mississippi would rush into where it had always been before, in the great floodplain of the Delta. The water would rush in. And that would mean that David Dixon Porter's gunboats could make their way along streams that were now much deeper, in bayous that were much deeper, into a little place called Moon Lake, and from there, the floodwaters, now inundating the Delta, would take them into the Coldwater River, which flows into the Tallahatchie River, which helps form the Yazoo, at a point at the Yazoo above the bluffs. And if he could do that, Vicksburg would be taken in a matter of weeks. So here's what they want to do. This way, eventually getting to the Yazoo right up there. Brilliant idea. The Army would follow the Navy, and a supply route would be there for Grant to take advantage of as much as he wanted. Brilliant idea. So up the Mississippi, 7 gunboats of David Dixon Porter's fleet began to steam, along with the 9 regiments in transports behind them of the Army of the Tennessee. They blew up the levee. 1,500 pounds of gunpowder, blew it up, vast, huge noise. And like the Niagara Falls, water cascaded into the Delta. And the old floodplain was now once more the possession of the Mississippi River. The waters rose by 8 feet right away. And that allowed the gunboats to make their way into Moon Lake and approach the Coldwater River, led by one of David Dixon Porter's favorite gunboats, the Baron de Kalb. Just a few words about these gunboats. This was a typical one. They were called the Turtles because farm boys along the Mississippi, when these things were being built, thought they looked an awful lot like turtles. And the engineer who designed a lot of them was named Pook, so they were always called Pook's Turtles during the Civil War. And these things were wonderful vessels, heavily armored, like 3 inches of armor. That meant they could take a lot of punishment if you were going to pepper them with cannonballs. And they were perfectly good as long as you had 6 feet of water. Very good at 6 feet of water. They were propelled by steam engines, of course, usually 2 steam engines, and they had a stern paddle on the back, which meant that they could make forward progress pretty well, but if you had to back up against anything like a current, you were going to make pretty slow progress. But these were very good vessels. The only 2 problems they really had were these. If they hit a mine, big problem. Hit a mine somewhere, probably they weren't going to go much further, probably be disabled. And the other problem they had was if a lucky shot hit the steam boilers of these turtles, that would mean putting a hole in the boiler that anybody nearby would be scalded by the steam so that they would be out of action and maybe killed. Those were the 2 things you had to worry about. But as far as cannonballs on the armor, these things would withstand an awful lot, and they were very good with just 6 feet of water, which is now what they had. So into Moon Lake they went. All went well, except all went slowly. Porter was not in personal command. He would have driven these guys very hard, but he had a subordinate in command, and that meant that it took weeks to get into the Coldwater River. And by the time they got into the Coldwater, it was so narrow that they could only go one at a time, and the trees were overhanging the banks here, which meant that the steam funnels were always in danger of being dented or maybe destroyed, which only slowed down progress all the more. And to make things even worse, conditions on these ships were terrible. If you were on the transports, if you were members of the Army of the Tennessee, and you were behind the gunboats on the transports, this was a terrible experience indeed. If you were down in the hold, you shared that space with the horses. It's one bad thing. And if you're on the deck, as it turned out, this being February of 1863, you were rained on almost constantly. Good for the turtles, they had plenty of water. Bad for you if you were on the deck, you were now waterlogged. But even that wasn't the worst. The worst thing was almost everybody had gotten dysentery back in Arkansas, which meant that this was about as bad as you can imagine. Day after day, week after week, miserable suffering. And the whole time, none other than Isaac Brown, the man who had piloted the Arkansas to Vicksburg the year before, was feverishly cutting down trees anywhere he could find them to impede the progress on the Coldwater and to delay the Union fleet as it approached the Tallahatchie. But finally, they got to the Tallahatchie. And they turned, and everybody was happy because the next step was the Yazoo, and if they could get to the Yazoo, that would mean victory was in sight. But too much time had gone by now. As they began to approach the Yazoo on the Tallahatchie, and here's a little bit what it looked like. Whoops. They found something in front of them they did not expect to see and that they were not at all delighted to see. What they saw was the wreckage of a ship sunk in the Tallahatchie River. And the ship was one of the most famous in the North. The ship happened to be the Star of the West, the same ship that James Buchanan had sent to try to supply Fort Sumter back in 1861. The Confederates had gotten a hold of the Star of the West by now. They sank it in the Tallahatchie, and now the wreckage was right in front of the ironclad fleet, which meant that they weren't going any further, not anytime soon. And if you go to the Tallahatchie today, you can still see, when the water is low, the remnants of the Star of the West. That's the Star of the West when the Citadel volunteers were firing on it in 1861. Now, this is a situation as Porter's subordinate in his fleet approached the Star of the West. They not only saw the ship, they also saw a fort, hastily put up by ever-enterprising Isaac Brown. A fort that had a couple cannon, a bunch of soldiers, very makeshift affair, but there was no way to maneuver around this fort. Too much swamp, too much wetness. You just had to attack it. And it might as well have been Gibraltar. There was no way to get around it. But they tried. They attacked what came to be called Fort Pemberton. You can still see some of the remnants of it, but there's actually a town there now, Greenwood, Mississippi. Here in the Delta, the center of the blues, the center of American music. Greenwood is now the center of the Delta, and that's where Fort Pemberton was. Greenwood, Mississippi. They did attack Fort Pemberton, and the commander of Fort Pemberton gave the Union soldiers and sailors everything they had. A rain of shot and shell came upon the attackers against Fort Pemberton, and the commander of Pemberton, a guy named Loring, kept saying, "Give them blizzards, men! Give them blizzards! Give them blizzards!" The kind of thing commanding officers say. Give them blizzards! So for the rest of his life, he became known as Old Blizzards. After this defense of Fort Pemberton, and in the narrow confines of the Tallahatchie, there was no way around it. The ironclads and the transports stalled in the swamp, in the water, in the rain, in the misery of the Delta, February 1863. No way to get through. The whole thing had failed. But Porter was not giving up. No sooner had it become clear to him they were not going to get through to Fort Pemberton. He came up with another idea, even better. And the other idea was to send those ironclads on a different route through the Delta. Instead of going way north where the levee was, and then south to the Tallahatchie and the Yazoo, why not go into the Yazoo? Here's the Yazoo, a little bit north of Vicksburg. Go up this bayou, Steele's Bayou, go through these rivers here, and eventually to Rolling Fork, way up there, and then south on the Sunflower River, just above the bluffs. And if they could do that, they avoid the bluffs, and they accomplish the same thing as they might have done if there had been no Fort Pemberton. Came to be called the Steele Bayou Expedition. It's going to be 200 miles of bayous and streams. But remember, the Delta was inundated, and there have been heavy rains. And these rivers down here, these bayous, were very, very deep by now, February 1863. So Porter thought it was worth a try. So that month, he tried this idea, and through the Delta, Porter, now in personal command, led 5 turtles in assorted transports heading north to Steele's Bayou, and what turned out to be perhaps the strangest naval expedition of the entire Civil War, and maybe in the history of the Navy. The problem was that these streams were so deep, you could wade across most of them normally, now they're about 15 feet deep. They were so deep that as the ironclads and the transports moved down the bayous and down the streams, to either side of them were treetops. And remember, the streams are relatively narrow, so when the ironclads would hit the branches of the treetops, any animal that had rescued itself by rushing up to the trees when the flood began now fell down upon the turtles and the transports. Every kind of animal was up there you can imagine. There were possums in those treetops, raccoons, lizards, mice. The kind of cockroach only to be found in Mississippi was up there in those treetops. And wildcats, too. Some of these guys were lifers in the Navy, and when they signed up, They probably never thought they'd be swarming wildcats on top of their vessels, but that's what they were doing now on the decks of Porter's fleet. And there were special broom details that were swarming away at the animals the whole time they're going. So they're making their way down as best they could. And of course, the treetops are everywhere, so these limbs are kept falling down on the vessel, doing damage every time. And naturally, it was bound to take some time, but Porter was in command now. And Porter was a hard charger. He had these things going no matter what. He made pretty good progress up Steele's Bayou, here, close to Rolling Fork. And the problem now was, the closer they got to the Sunflower River, which is where they have to go eventually to get back down to the Yazoo, the closer they got to the Sunflower, the more cotton land they began to approach. And the result of that was any Confederate anywhere near set fire to the cotton bales rather than allow the Union to get anywhere near them. And the consequence was, on either side of those narrow streams, burning cotton over here, burning cotton over there, and if the streams were narrow, as many of them were, Porter might have about 4 feet between the side of his vessels in the bank. One of the streams was 46 feet, he had 42 feet wide on the ironclads. It was a 46 feet bayou he was in. And on both sides there's burning cotton bales, and the consequence was that there were points where the flames were licking up against the ironclads, and the men inside were in every danger of being roasted alive if those flames were ever to get out of control, which meant that Porter kept having to hose down, stamping down the decks to make sure the fires didn't spread, and that slowed them down. But at least they kept going. Somehow they kept going, and they got into Rolling Fork at the very top of the map, having gone through half their journey in the strange detail, the strange plan of Porter's. When they got there, the worst obstacle of all presented itself. By now, they're not just to the side of treetops. Now they're on top of treetops. Great willow trees were now below them, so thick that they clogged the stern propellers of the ironclads. There was no way to get through the willows. The willow branches now stopped Porter's fleet. And the only thing they could now do was get out of there, start swimming in the bayous, and cut away those willows, which was going to take time. And in the meantime, the transports for Sherman's army, and Sherman was along with them, were well behind the gunboats, further back down, and right in front of the Confederates, right in front of Porter, right in front of the Union, right in front of Porter, were Confederate troops who now opened fire at them as they were trying to make their way out of those willows. Here was a crisis. If those Confederates could capture the ironclads before Sherman's troops could get up there to join them, this would be a monumental disaster. Might even put an end to the Vicksburg campaign. And Porter was staring catastrophe in the face, trapped in the willow branches, Confederates in front of him, Sherman miles behind. The only thing that could help would be for Sherman to get there quickly and rescue him, even though darkness had fallen, even though he could barely see a way through in the flooded delta. Maybe somehow Sherman could get there, but he had to be told of the danger. So Porter wrote one of the shortest messages in naval history, and the message he wrote down was, "Dear Sherman, hurry up for heaven's sake." He took the message and he gave it to a freed slave who lived in the Delta, a freed slave named Tubb, who knows his way around despite the floods. And Tubb put that message, according to the story, in his hair, and he rushed into the darkness. And he found where Sherman was, and Sherman, to his credit, didn't hesitate a minute. Woke everybody up, and he had them marching as best as he could on whatever dry land he could find. And to make sure they didn't get lost, he had his men light little fires on pine knots. So he held these little pine knot flames in front of them. And luckily, as the sun was coming up, and as day was breaking up the next day, he found Porter, and once the soldiers arrived, Porter's fleet was saved. Well, he found Porter, but there was no going any further. The Steele Bayou expedition had failed. Willow branches were too thick, Confederates were too strong, they weren't going to get to the Yazoo that way. And thus it was, by March of 1863, Porter and Grant had to face one very bad fact. And that is that they had a choice. Choice number one, forget the whole thing. Take Grant's army, which was west of the Mississippi, take it back up to Memphis, go back down on the east side, which is what Grant tried to do the year before. But if he were to do that, which is what Sherman wanted to do, if Grant were to do that, he would be admitting that the last 4 months of fighting wildcats and mosquitoes had been worth nothing. And the North would be full of demoralization, which meant Grant wasn't going to do that, which meant bad option number 2. And that is, Porter was going to have to risk those ironclads. He was going to have to send them past the great batteries on the Vicksburg bluffs, around DeSoto Bend, south of Vicksburg. And once he got south of Vicksburg, he was going to have to meet Grant's army marching down the western bank, take it across the Mississippi, and leave Grant all but isolated on the eastern bank, approaching Vicksburg from the south, risking destruction to the Army of the Tennessee with a very tenuous supply line. Something most generals would not have done. But to Porter's and Grant's credit, they both knew that's it. That's what you got to do. And Porter decided to risk the destruction of the Navy, and Grant decided to risk the destruction of the Army of the Tennessee to take Vicksburg, and what they now believed was the only way to win, at least in the campaign season of 1863. And so, the great fear was faced. Now, what would happen if those ironclads are moving past Vicksburg to get south of Vicksburg? What would happen if the batteries opened up and they sank the first few ironclads, leaving them to careen out of control on the channel of the Mississippi, leaving the other ships to have to avoid them and slow down and risk their own destruction? That would mean, of course, catastrophe. But Porter was willing to risk it, and he'd risk it in person. He would be on the first ironclad, moving in the dead of night past Vicksburg. And so they decided to do it. The night of April 16th, 1863, was when the fleet began to move. Waiting for them, south of Vicksburg, was Sherman, who had a little fleet of gunboats south of the city, ready to put into the channel to rescue any of the wounded and desperate survivors who might be clinging to wreckage, once the current carried ruined ships south of the city. Nobody knew what to expect, but they made the attempt. And thus, that night, April 16th, 1863, one of the great events of the war took place. Silently, without getting up steam yet, moving with the current, Porter, his ironclads, a couple transports behind him, began to approach DeSoto Bend. Nobody says a sound. Complete darkness. Then they began to round the tip of the peninsula, and the bluffs of Vicksburg began to be visible just in front of them. And that's when the Confederates knew they were coming. They lit up cotton bales, whatever they could find, on the other side of the Mississippi, creating a silhouette effect so they could aim up the ironclads, now moving past the batteries. And every cannon, every piece of artillery, every gun on the heights of Vicksburg opened fire, breaking the deathly silence all at once. A torrent of shells rained down upon the ironclads. Nobody had ever seen anything like this. This is something that it looked like. But the fact is, it was indescribable. Everybody who lived through it said almost the same thing. I can't describe what it was like. It seemed, one person said, it seemed as though heaven and earth were both out to destroy us. I can never forget it. Some of the gunboats, having been hit repeatedly by cannonballs, spun into the eddies out of control, but basically, not surely, but slowly, they kept making their way with the current past the batteries nonetheless. The entire place was lit up like noonday. So much fire, so many explosions. But on the gunboats themselves, it was like it was midnight because they were surrounded by smoke, surrounded by confusion, surrounded by sound, surrounded by chaos. And yet they made their way down past the batteries. One of the transports was sunk. But miraculously, the ironclads got through. They were all damaged, but they could easily be repaired. They all got through. And even more miraculously, nobody was killed. They go to the south of Vicksburg. And forever after, the Confederates on the bluffs, who were shooting down at the ironclads, blamed this event, the fact that they couldn't sink the fleet, on a new set of shells they had just gotten from Richmond, where the fuses were not properly attached, or not properly ready. I don't know if that's the reason, but I do know that Porter was now south of Vicksburg, and the Confederacy was all but cut in two. 2 weeks later, at a point a long way south of Vicksburg, actually, Porter met Grant's army, the Army of the Tennessee, ferried it across to the eastern bank, and with that tenuous line of supply they now had, Grant landed on the east bank of the Mississippi at Bloomsburg, Mississippi, and went north towards Vicksburg and Destiny. Grant said, as soon as he got on the eastern bank of the Mississippi, he felt the greatest sense of relief of his life. And that tells you something about Grant. Most people would be petrified. Middle of enemy territory now, very little of a supply line, and yet he was relieved. That's all you need to know about Grant. He fought 3 battles in the next few weeks, got around to the west of Vicksburg, fended off Confederate forces sent to intercept him, and laid siege to the city by May. And 7 weeks later, on July 4th, as we all know, Vicksburg surrendered. Thus ended what I consider to be the greatest example of Army-Navy cooperation during the Civil War, and maybe during the whole 19th century. What Porter and Grant had done was showed how 2 commanders in different services of a like mind can accomplish whatever they set out to do, as long as they've got the resources and the will. And the only comparison I could really think of is the cooperation of Eisenhower and Kent Hewitt in the Mediterranean during World War II.